The mistake that would change everything happened at 3:47 in the afternoon, when Sarah McKenna decided to trust a stranger's directions through Devil's Canyon instead of following the main trail back to town. Death had been stalking the Colorado Territory for weeks now, disguised as the worst blizzard in living memory. It claimed livestock, buried homesteads, and turned familiar paths into white graveyards where travelers vanished without trace. The storm had already taken her horse, her supplies, and very nearly her life when she stumbled into the abandoned mining camp just as darkness began swallowing the mountains. She had been walking for 6 hours through knee-deep snow, her leather boots soaked through, her fingers so numb she could barely feel the rifle she clutched against her chest. The wind howled through the canyon like the screams of lost souls, driving ice crystals into her face until her cheeks bled. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps that crystallized instantly in the frigid air. The camp materialized from the white void like a mirage. 3 weathered buildings huddled against the mountainside, their roofs heavy with snow that threatened to collapse at any moment. Windows stared blindly into the storm, dark and empty as dead eyes. But there, in the largest structure, a thin ribbon of smoke rose from a stone chimney, barely visible against the grey-white sky. Sarah's legs nearly gave out from relief. She forced herself forward, each step a monumental effort through the drifts that rose past her waist in places. Her woolen coat, soaked through hours ago, had become a frozen shell that cracked with every movement. Ice had formed in her dark hair, creating a crystalline crown that caught what little light filtered through the storm. The door stood slightly ajar, snow piled against its base. She pushed it open with her shoulder, too exhausted to knock or call out. Warmth hit her like a physical blow, so intense after hours in the cold that she gasped and stumbled forward, her rifle clattering to the floor. He was there, crouched beside a stone fireplace where flames danced hungrily over split logs, tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a beard that couldn't quite hide the sharp angles of his face. His clothes were simple but well made, a wool shirt the color of charcoal, leather pants worn smooth from years of use, boots that had seen 1,000 miles of hard country. When he turned to look at her, she saw eyes the color of winter sky, pale blue and startling in their intensity. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the wind's relentless assault on the walls outside. Sarah swayed on her feet, ice beginning to melt from her coat and pool on the rough wooden floor. Her lips, blue with cold, moved soundlessly as she tried to form words. He rose slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. She noticed the way his hand hovered near the pistol on his hip, not threatening but ready. In the territories, survival often depended on such caution. Strangers could be salvation or death, and there was rarely time to determine which before making a choice that would echo through whatever remained of your life. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with rough-hewn log walls blackened by years of smoke and weather. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and sitting area. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins of food, ammunition, and supplies that suggested someone had been planning to winter here. A bedroll lay near the far wall, neatly arranged. Tools hung from pegs, a pick, shovel, pan for sifting gold from stream beds. This had been a miner's cabin once, before the veins played out and the men moved on to chase other dreams. Sarah tried to speak again, but only managed a sound somewhere between a whisper and a sob. The warmth was bringing feeling back to her extremities, and with it came pain so intense she nearly collapsed. Her hands, her feet, her face, everything burned as circulation returned to tissues that had been on the verge of freezing permanently. The man stepped forward, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Up close, she could see the details that distance had obscured. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against skin that had been darkened by years under the western sun. His hands, when he reached toward her, were large and calloused, the hands of someone who had worked with tools and weapons, and whatever else was necessary to survive in a land that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. "You need to get out of those clothes," he said, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You'll die if you don't." The words cut through the haze of cold and exhaustion that had settled over her mind. She looked down at herself and realized he was right. Her coat had frozen solid in places, and ice crystals had formed along the seams of her dress where moisture had seeped through. Her stockings were frozen to her legs. If she didn't warm herself soon, frostbite would claim fingers and toes, maybe more. But she was alone with a stranger in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help and no means of escape if his intentions proved less than honorable. The rifle lay where she had dropped it, too far away to reach quickly. Her fingers were too numb to grip it properly anyway. He seemed to understand her hesitation. Moving slowly, he walked to the far end of the cabin and retrieved a heavy wool blanket from his bedroll. When he returned, he set it on a chair near the fire and stepped back, putting distance between them. "I'll turn around," he said. "Get warm, we'll figure out the rest after." There was something in his voice, a weariness that spoke of hard-won understanding about the choices people faced when survival hung in the balance. Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of deception or predatory intent. She found neither. What she saw instead was a man who had learned to read situations quickly and accurately, who understood that in the wilderness, helping someone survive was often the difference between remaining human and becoming something else entirely. The fire's warmth was irresistible. She could feel her body beginning to shut down, hypothermia starting to claim her despite being indoors. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her coat, but the ice had made them impossible to manipulate. Frustration brought tears to her eyes, tears that would have frozen solid if she had still been outside. Without a word, he stepped forward and began working at the buttons with fingers that, while rough, moved with surprising gentleness. She stood perfectly still, acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the concentration on his face as he freed her from the frozen garment. When the coat fell away, she gasped at the sudden lightness, at the absence of the weight that had been dragging her down for hours. Her dress came next, the fabric so stiff with ice that it stood by itself when he set it aside. She was left in her undergarments, shivering violently as her body tried to generate heat it no longer possessed. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and guided her to a chair positioned close to the fire, close enough that she could feel the heat on her face and hands. "What's your name?" he asked, settling into another chair across from her. "Sarah," she managed, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Sarah McKenna." He nodded. "Thomas Brennan. You came through Devil's Canyon." She nodded, not trusting her voice for more words. The canyon was notorious among travelers, a narrow passage through the mountains that could be treacherous even in good weather. In a blizzard, it was a death trap. Only desperation or very poor judgment would lead someone to attempt it alone. "What were you running from?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. Not where had she come from, or where was she going, but what was she running from? As if he understood that no one ended up in Devil's Canyon during the worst storm in memory, unless they were fleeing something worse than death by freezing. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly aware that her situation had not improved as much as she had thought. She was still alone with a stranger, still defenseless, still completely dependent on his goodwill for her survival. The warmth of the fire was returning sensation to her body, but with it came a hyper-awareness of her vulnerability. Thomas seemed to sense her discomfort. He rose from his chair and moved to the shelves along the wall, keeping his back to her as he retrieved items that clinked softly in the firelight. When he returned, he carried a tin cup filled with something that steamed and smelled of coffee and whiskey. "Drink this," he said, offering her the cup. "It'll help warm you from the inside." She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her hands around the metal despite the fact that it was almost too hot to touch. The liquid burned going down, but it was a good burn, spreading warmth through her chest and belly. She drank it in small sips, feeling strength return to her body with each swallow. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountains. Wind rattled the windows in their frames and sent occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney, filling the cabin with the scent of burning pine. Snow continued to fall, visible in brief glimpses, when the wind shifted the curtains of white that obscured everything beyond a few feet from the walls. "The storm will last through tomorrow, maybe longer," Thomas said, settling back into his chair. "You picked a hell of a time to be traveling alone." She looked up from her cup, studying his face in the firelight. The scar that marked his left side seemed to shift and dance in the flickering illumination, giving him an almost mythical appearance. There was something about him that suggested violence, not in an immediate threatening way, but in the manner of someone who had seen and done things that left permanent marks on the soul as well as the body. "I didn't have a choice," she said finally. He waited for her to elaborate, but when she didn't, he simply nodded. In the territories, everyone had secrets, everyone had reasons for being where they were that they preferred not to share. Survival often depended on accepting that reality and focusing on the present rather than the past. The warmth of the cabin, the whiskey, and the exhaustion from her ordeal began to take their toll. Sarah found her eyelids growing heavy despite her wariness of the situation. She had been walking through the storm for most of the day, fighting for her life with each step. Her body was demanding rest, even if her mind remained alert to the potential dangers of her situation. Thomas noticed her struggle to stay awake. "You need sleep," he said. "Take the bed, I'll keep the fire going." She shook her head quickly. "I can't take your bed." "You'll take it, or you'll die," he said matter-of-factly. Hypothermia doesn't care about politeness. The blunt statement cut through her protests. She looked toward the bedroll in the corner, then back at Thomas. In the firelight, his expression was serious but not unkind. She realized that he was right about more than just her immediate physical needs. In this place, at this time, conventional social rules were luxuries that could prove fatal. She rose from the chair, still wrapped in the blanket, and made her way to the corner where his bedroll lay. It was a simple arrangement, thick wool blankets over what appeared to be pine boughs for cushioning, but it looked like paradise compared to the frozen ground outside, where she would certainly have died if she hadn't found this place. As she settled onto the bedroll, she became aware of Thomas moving about the cabin, adding wood to the fire, checking the windows, performing the small tasks that kept civilization alive in the wilderness. The sounds were oddly comforting, suggesting routine and safety in a world that had offered precious little of either. She closed her eyes, but sleep remained elusive. Every sound from outside made her tense, expecting the door to burst open and reveal whatever it was she had been fleeing. Every shift of the wind, every creak of the walls settling under the weight of snow sent adrenaline coursing through her exhausted body. Time passed in a strange suspension between waking and sleeping. The warmth gradually seeped deeper into her bones, chasing away the cold that had threatened to claim her life. She could hear Thomas moving occasionally, tending the fire, checking the door, maintaining the fragile bubble of safety they had created in the midst of the storm. When she finally spoke, her voice was small in the darkness. "Thomas? Yeah, thank you." There was a long pause before he answered. "Don't thank me yet. Storm's not over." His words carried a weight that seemed to encompass more than just the weather outside. She understood that he was talking about survival in its broadest sense, about the challenges that would face them when morning came, about the decisions they would have to make, and the prices they might have to pay. But for now she was warm and alive, and that was enough. She pulled the blankets closer around herself and let her eyes drift closed, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sounds of Thomas keeping watch through the night. The last thing she heard before sleep finally claimed her was the soft sound of wood being added to the fire and the whispered promise of warmth continuing through the darkness. Sarah awoke to the sound of something moving outside the cabin. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert despite the exhaustion that still weighed down her limbs. The fire had burned lower during the night, casting longer shadows across the rough wooden walls. Through the single window, she could see that dawn was breaking, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of grey and pale blue. Thomas was no longer in the chair where she had last seen him. Instead, he stood near the window, his body tense and still as he peered through the frost-covered glass. In his hand he held his pistol, the metal gleaming dully in the weak morning light. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the dying fire. He held up a hand for silence, his attention focused entirely on whatever he had seen or heard outside. Sarah remained motionless on the bedroll, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. In the territories, anything that moved during a blizzard was either desperate or dangerous, and neither option offered much comfort. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas relaxed slightly and moved away from the window. "Wolves," he said quietly, "probably drawn by the smoke. They're hungry this time of year." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had heard stories about wolf packs in the mountains, how they grew bold during harsh winters when their usual prey became scarce. A pack could tear through a cabin door if they were desperate enough, and humans were much easier targets than the elk and deer they normally hunted. "How many?" she asked. "Hard to tell. At least 3, maybe more." He moved to the shelves and began gathering items: ammunition, a second pistol, a long knife that looked like it had seen considerable use. "They won't try anything during daylight, but we need to be ready if they're still around when night falls." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about the threat sent a shiver through Sarah's body. This was his world, she realized. A place where survival was measured in hours rather than days, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. She had stumbled into it unprepared, carrying nothing but desperation and the clothes on her back. Thomas added wood to the fire, building it up until flames danced high against the stone chimney. The increased light and warmth pushed back the shadows, making the cabin feel more secure despite the threats that lurked beyond its walls. "Tell me about Millfield," he said suddenly. Sarah started at the mention of the town she had been trying to reach. "How did you know?" "Only place you could have been heading through Devil's Canyon. It's the only settlement within 50 miles that direction." He settled into the chair across from her, his pale blue eyes studying her face. "What's waiting for you there?" She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly aware that she was still wearing only her undergarments. Her dress and coat hung near the fire, steam rising from them as the ice continued to melt. They would need hours to dry properly, time they might not have if the wolves decided to test the cabin's defenses. "Work," she said finally. "There's a school there that needs a teacher." It was true as far as it went, but it was also incomplete, missing the crucial details that had driven her into the storm rather than waiting for safer travel conditions. Thomas seemed to sense the omission, but he didn't press her for more information. "You have family back east?" he asked instead. "Not anymore." The words came out more bitter than she had intended. She looked away from his searching gaze, focusing instead on the flames that danced in the fireplace. "What about you? What brings you to an abandoned mining camp in the middle of nowhere?" "The gold played out 2 months ago," he said. "Most of the miners moved on, but I stayed. Sometimes a man needs a place where nobody asks questions." There was something in his voice that suggested depths she hadn't yet plumbed, secrets that ran as deep as her own. She found herself studying his face, trying to read the story written in the lines around his eyes, the set of his mouth, the way he held himself even when sitting still. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the canyon, but the snow had stopped falling. Through the window, Sarah could see that several feet had accumulated during the night, creating drifts that would make travel impossible for days. The realization that she was truly trapped here, dependent on Thomas for her survival, sent a complex mix of fear and something else through her chest. "The school in Millfield," Thomas said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "They expecting you at a particular time?" "I was supposed to arrive 3 days ago." She thought of the letter in her coat pocket, the one that had promised her a new life, far from the mistakes and tragedies that had defined her existence back east. "They've probably given the position to someone else by now." "Maybe. Or maybe they understand that travel's been impossible with the storm. People in these parts know how to wait when they have to." His words offered a comfort she hadn't expected. In the cities back east, punctuality was everything, and a missed appointment could destroy a reputation permanently. But here, where nature's whims could delay even the most determined traveler, different rules applied. Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the shelves again, this time retrieving tins of food and a small pot. "We should eat something," he said. "Keep our strength up." Sarah watched as he prepared a simple meal over the fire. Beans and salt pork, hardtack that had to be soaked to make it edible, coffee that filled the cabin with its rich aroma. The domestic nature of the tasks created an odd intimacy in the small space, as if they were a couple who had been sharing this routine for years, rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. When the food was ready, he served it on tin plates and handed one to her along with a fork that had seen better days. She ate gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was despite everything that had happened. The simple fare tasted better than any meal she could remember, flavored by survival and the basic human need for sustenance. "You said you were running from something," Thomas said as they ate. "Yesterday, I mean, when you first arrived." Sarah paused with the fork halfway to her mouth. She had hoped he would forget about that, or at least have the courtesy not to mention it again. But she was learning that Thomas was not a man who forgot details, especially ones that might be important for survival. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most things worth running from are." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Neither accusation nor absolution, but something in between. Sarah found herself looking into those pale blue eyes and seeing not judgment, but understanding. Whatever his own story was, it had taught him that people sometimes found themselves in situations where running was the only option left. "There was a man back in Philadelphia," she said slowly. "A wealthy man, who was used to getting what he wanted. He decided he wanted me. Thomas nodded, his expression unchanging. And when you said no? He didn't accept that as an answer. He had influence, connections. He could have destroyed my reputation, made it impossible for me to find work anywhere in the city. She set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. So I left, packed what I could carry, and took the first train heading west. And he followed you? His men did. They tracked me to Denver, then to Leadville. Every time I thought I was safe, they would appear, asking questions, showing my photograph to people, offering rewards for information about where I had gone. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, remembering the constant fear that had driven her from town to town. I heard about the position in Millfield and decided to try one more time to disappear completely. Into Devil's Canyon, during the worst storm in memory, Thomas said. That's either very brave or very desperate. Desperate, she admitted. Definitely desperate. The confession seemed to hang in the air between them, creating a shift in the atmosphere of the cabin. Sarah felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her state of undress, as if admitting her circumstances out loud had stripped away the last of her defenses. Thomas finished his meal in silence, then gathered the plates and cleaned them with snow melted in a small pot over the fire. His movements were efficient and practiced, suggesting long experience with taking care of himself in primitive conditions. When he finished, he returned to his position near the window, scanning the landscape for signs of the wolves or any other threats. They're still out there, he said after a few minutes. Staying back but watching. They know we're in here. Sarah joined him at the window, careful to keep the blanket wrapped around herself. In the growing daylight, she could see shapes moving among the trees that bordered the clearing where the mining camp sat. Dark forms that seemed to materialize and vanish like shadows, always staying just at the edge of visibility. How long will they wait? She asked. As long as they have to. Wolves are patient hunters. They'll test our defenses, look for weaknesses, wait for us to make a mistake. He glanced at her, his expression serious. The good news is that they're more afraid of us than we are of them, as long as we don't give them a reason to think we're easy prey. And if they decide we are easy prey, then we fight. He touched the pistol at his hip, then gestured toward the rifle she had dropped the night before. You know how to use that? Sarah looked at the weapon, remembering the weight of it in her hands during the long walk through the storm. My father taught me when I was younger, but it's been years since I've fired a gun. It's like riding a horse. You don't forget. Thomas retrieved the rifle and checked its condition, working the action to ensure it was functioning properly. 5 shots, if I'm counting right, plus my 2 pistols. Should be enough to discourage them if it comes to that. The casual way he discussed the possibility of violence sent another chill through Sarah's body. She had grown up in a world where conflicts were resolved with words and social pressure, where physical violence was something that happened to other people in other places. But here, in this remote cabin with wolves circling outside, such civilized notions seemed as fragile as morning frost. Have you ever killed a man? She asked suddenly, the question emerging before she could stop herself. Thomas was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes. The single word carried more weight than any lengthy explanation could have provided. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he continued to watch the wolves, seeing him with new eyes. The scar on his face, the way he moved with unconscious awareness of his surroundings, the casual competence with weapons, all of it suddenly made sense. Was it self-defense? She asked. It usually is out here, but that doesn't make it easier to live with. The pain in his voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah realized that whatever violence he had been involved in, it had left marks on his soul as well as his face. In that moment, she felt a connection to him that had nothing to do with their shared circumstances and everything to do with the recognition of someone else who carried burdens they couldn't set down. The day passed slowly, marked by the gradual movement of shadows across the cabin floor and the persistent presence of the wolves in the tree line. Thomas maintained his watch, occasionally moving to different windows to check various angles of approach. Sarah tried to help by monitoring the fire and preparing simple meals, but mostly she found herself studying this man who had become her unlikely protector. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temperature began to drop again. The wolves grew bolder, moving closer to the cabin in small groups before retreating when Thomas appeared at a window. Their behavior suggested increasing desperation, the kind that might eventually overcome their natural fear of humans. They'll make their move tonight, Thomas said, as he added wood to the fire. "Probably after midnight when they think we're asleep. That's when they like to hunt." Sarah nodded, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. The reality of their situation was becoming impossible to ignore. They were trapped in a small cabin, surrounded by predators with limited ammunition and no possibility of rescue until the snow melted enough to make travel possible again. "What do we do?" she asked. "We survive." Thomas checked his weapons again, then positioned the rifle near the window where he could reach it quickly. "One way or another, we survive." The attack came at 2:37 in the morning, announced by a scratching sound against the cabin's eastern wall that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. She had been lying awake on the bedroll, listening to Thomas move quietly around the cabin as he maintained his vigil. The fire had been built up to cast maximum light, eliminating the shadows where predators might hide their approach. Every few minutes, she heard the soft sound of his boots on the wooden floor as he moved from window to window, checking the perimeter with the methodical patience of someone who understood that survival often depended on such attention to detail. The scratching came again, deliberate and persistent, as if something with claws was testing the strength of the logs that formed the cabin's walls. Sarah sat up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the firelight, she could see Thomas frozen near the front window, his pistol drawn and pointed toward the sound. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the flames. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against Sarah's eardrums. She found herself holding her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate where the wolves had gone or what they might be planning next. The cabin felt suddenly fragile around them, its walls no more substantial than paper against the primal hunger that circled outside. A low howl rose from somewhere beyond the northern wall, answered immediately by another from the south. The sounds were closer than Sarah had expected, close enough that she could hear the individual tones and inflections that distinguished one animal from another. The pack was communicating, coordinating their approach with an intelligence that made them far more dangerous than simple beasts driven by hunger. Thomas moved to the center of the cabin, positioning himself where he could respond to threats from any direction. In the firelight, his face was set in hard lines, all traces of the gentleness she had glimpsed during their conversations erased by the immediate demands of survival. This was the man who had killed before, she realized. This was what he became when violence was the only option left. "How many?" she whispered. "At least 6. Maybe more." His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the windows and the door for signs of an imminent assault. "They're testing us, trying to figure out how we'll respond." As if summoned by his words, a tremendous impact struck the cabin's front door. The entire structure shook under the force, and Sarah heard the wooden bar that secured the entrance creak ominously. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams, and the fire flickered as the shock wave disturbed the air in the small space. Thomas moved to the window beside the door, peering carefully through the frost-covered glass. "Big male," he said. 150 pounds at least. He's backing up for another run." The second impact was even more violent than the first. The door held, but Sarah could see that the wooden bar was beginning to splinter where it met the iron brackets that secured it to the wall. 2 more hits like that, maybe 3, and the wolves would be inside the cabin where teeth and claws would negate every advantage that walls and weapons provided. "The back window," Thomas said urgently. "Check it, now." Sarah scrambled from the bedroll, still wrapped in the blanket, and pressed her face to the small window that looked out over the rear of the cabin. At first, she saw nothing but darkness and snow. Then movement caught her eye, a flowing shadow that separated itself from the tree line and began approaching the cabin with the fluid grace of a natural predator. "There's one coming from behind," she reported, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the terror that gripped her chest. "They're trying to drive us toward the door," Thomas said. "Classic pack behavior. Force the prey to run, then take them down in the open." A third impact against the door sent splinters flying across the cabin floor. The wooden bar was definitely weakening now, bowing under the repeated assaults. Sarah could hear the wolves outside growing more excited, their howls rising in pitch and frequency as they sensed that their prey was nearly within reach. Thomas handed her the rifle, his movements quick and economical. "When I tell you, put a shot through that back window. Don't aim for the wolf, just make noise. We need them to think we have more firepower than we actually do." Sarah's hands shook as she accepted the weapon. It felt heavier than she remembered, its wooden stock worn smooth by years of use. She had learned to shoot as a child on her father's farm, plinking at bottles and fence posts with a smaller rifle under his patient instruction. But those had been games, pleasant afternoon diversions that bore no resemblance to the life-or-death situation she now faced. The fourth impact against the door was accompanied by the sharp crack of splintering wood. The bar held, but barely. One more blow would certainly finish it, and then there would be nothing between them and the pack, except whatever courage and skill they could muster in the few seconds before the wolves reached them. "Now," Thomas said. Sarah raised the rifle to her shoulder, aimed it at the center of the back window and pulled the trigger. The explosion of sound in the confined space was deafening, and the recoil drove the weapon stock hard against her shoulder. Glass shattered outward into the night, and she heard a yelp of surprise from whatever had been approaching from that direction. But the victory was short-lived. Even as the echo of the gunshot faded, the final assault on the front door began. This time, it wasn't a single wolf throwing its weight against the barrier. Instead, Sarah heard the scrabbling of multiple sets of claws and the sound of bodies working together to tear at the weakened wood. Thomas took position beside the door, his pistol ready. "When they come through, aim for the biggest one first. Don't waste shots on wounded animals unless they're still coming at you." The door gave way with a grinding crash that sent the remains of the wooden bar skittering across the floor. For a moment, the opening remained empty, a rectangle of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent potential. Then the wolves came through in a rush of grey fur and gleaming teeth, moving with the coordinated precision of predators who had hunted together for years. Thomas fired twice in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes illuminating the attackers in stark detail. The first wolf, the massive male who had led the assault on the door, stumbled and fell, but immediately began trying to regain its feet. The second shot took down a smaller female who had been angling towards Sarah's position near the back wall, but there were more behind them. Sarah saw at least 3 additional shapes pouring through the destroyed doorway, their eyes reflecting the firelight like demons emerging from hell itself. She worked the rifle's action, chambering another round, and fired at the nearest wolf. The shot took it high in the chest, spinning it around, but not dropping it immediately. The wounded animal recovered its balance and came straight at her, its lips pulled back to reveal fangs that seemed impossibly white and sharp in the dancing light from the fireplace. Sarah tried to work the rifle's action again, but her hands were shaking too badly to manipulate the mechanism properly. The wolf gathered itself for a leap that would carry it directly to her throat. Thomas's third shot caught the animal in midair, the heavy slug from his pistol stopping its forward momentum and dropping it to the cabin floor just inches from where Sarah stood. She stared down at the body, noting how the predator's eyes had already begun to lose their fierce intelligence, becoming just pieces of colored glass that reflected the flames. But the fight was not over. 2 wolves remained on their feet, circling now in the small space of the cabin, looking for an opening that would allow them to close with their human prey. One was limping badly from Thomas's first shot, but it was still dangerous, still capable of killing if given the opportunity. The other appeared uninjured, a lean female with scars across her muzzle that spoke of previous battles and hard-won survival. Thomas had 1 shot left in his first pistol, and Sarah could see him calculating angles and distances with the cold precision of someone who had faced similar situations before. The wounded male wolf was closer to him, the female nearer to Sarah's position. If he took the shot at the male, the female would have time to reach her before he could draw his second weapon. "Sarah," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the wolves, "when I shoot, you run for the door." She understood what he was telling her. He was going to sacrifice his position, maybe his life, to give her a chance to escape into the night. It was the gesture of someone who had found something worth protecting, something more valuable than his own survival. But Sarah had not come this far, had not endured everything she had endured, only to watch another person die because of her choices. Instead of moving toward the door, she stepped sideways, putting herself between Thomas and the female wolf. The animal's attention shifted to her, recognizing the movement as either a threat or an opportunity. "No," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "We fight them together." The female wolf tensed for its attack, every muscle in its lean body coiled like a spring. Sarah raised the rifle again, her hands steady now despite everything that had happened. She had found her courage in the most unlikely place, not in her own survival, but in her refusal to let Thomas sacrifice himself for her. The wolf leaped at the same moment Thomas fired at the wounded male. Both shots echoed through the cabin simultaneously, creating a thunderclap of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small building. The male wolf dropped immediately, Thomas's final bullet finding its mark with deadly accuracy. The female twisted in midair as Sarah's shot took it through the shoulder, but its momentum carried it forward into her body. The impact drove her backward against the cabin wall, the rifle flying from her hands. The wolf's weight pressed against her chest, its injured shoulder preventing it from using its front claws effectively, but its teeth were still fully functional. She felt hot breath on her face and saw intelligence in the predator's eyes, the calculating look of an animal that knew it was dying, but intended to take its killer along. Then Thomas was there, his second pistol in his hand, but he couldn't risk a shot with Sarah and the wolf so close together, couldn't trust his aim when a mistake would kill the person he was trying to save. Instead, he reversed the weapon and brought its heavy butt down on the back of the wolf's skull with all the force he could muster. The animal went limp instantly, its weight becoming dead mass that pinned Sarah against the wall. Thomas holstered the pistol and pulled the body away from her, checking her for injuries with hands that moved with gentle efficiency despite the violence they had just witnessed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Sarah took inventory of herself, surprised to discover that she was essentially unharmed. There were scratches on her arms where the wolf's claws had found purchase during their struggle, and her shoulder ached from the impact against the wall, but nothing seemed to be seriously damaged. "I think I'm all right," she said, then looked around the cabin at the carnage they had survived. "Are they all dead?" Thomas moved methodically from body to body, checking each wolf to ensure it posed no further threat. When he finished his examination, he nodded grimly. 5 dead. The one that was at the back window ran off when you fired through the glass. It might come back, but not tonight. Wolves don't like fighting when they've already lost pack members. The reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had faced a coordinated attack by one of nature's most efficient predators and survived through a combination of preparation, courage, and sheer determination. The cabin looked like a battlefield, with blood on the floors and walls, glass scattered everywhere and the front door hanging in splinters from its broken hinges, but they were alive. Thomas began the process of dragging the wolf carcasses outside, working methodically, despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of his body. Sarah helped as much as she could, though the dead animals were heavier than she had expected and difficult to maneuver through the destroyed doorway. When the cabin was clear of bodies, Thomas used boards torn from the interior walls to create a makeshift barrier across the door opening. It wouldn't stop a determined human, much less another wolf pack, but it would provide some protection against the wind and snow that continued to blow through the mountains. The fire had burned low during the battle, and Sarah worked to build it back up while Thomas cleaned and reloaded his weapons. The domestic tasks felt surreal after the violence they had just survived, but they were necessary for continued survival. In the wilderness, there was no time to process trauma or celebrate victories. There was only the next challenge and the preparations required to meet it. "We need to talk," Thomas said when they had finished their immediate tasks and settled back into chairs near the restored fire. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't certain she was ready for whatever conversation he had in mind. The events of the past few hours had changed something fundamental between them, creating bonds that went deeper than simple gratitude or physical attraction. They had faced death together and chosen to protect each other over their own survival. Such experiences created connections that couldn't be easily broken or forgotten. "What you did back there," he continued, "stepping between me and that wolf, that was either very brave or very stupid." "Probably both," she admitted. "But I couldn't let you die for me, not when you'd already done so much." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if searching for words that could adequately express his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass far more than their current situation. "I haven't had anyone worth protecting in a long time," he said. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have something to lose." The admission hung in the air between them, creating an intimacy that had nothing to do with their physical proximity and everything to do with the recognition of shared vulnerability. Sarah realized that Thomas's protective instincts during the wolf attack had been about more than simple chivalry or frontier courtesy. They had been about something deeper, something that connected to his own needs and desires in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Tell me about your scar," she said gently. Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to the white line that marked his face from temple to jaw. "Knife fight in a saloon in Deadwood. 3 years ago. I was gambling, winning more than the house liked. When I got up to leave, 4 men tried to take my money back. What happened? I killed 2 of them. The third one gave me this." He traced the scar with his fingertip. "The fourth one ran. Word got around about what I'd done, about how fast I was with a gun. Suddenly, every young hothead looking to make a reputation wanted to try me. I got tired of killing boys who thought they were men." Sarah could hear the pain in his voice, the weight of accumulated violence that had driven him to seek isolation in an abandoned mining camp. She understood now why he had chosen to stay when the other miners left, why he preferred solitude to the company of people who might eventually force him to become the man he no longer wanted to be. "Is that why you're running too?" she asked. "From who you used to be? Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure out who I am when I'm not killing people." He looked at her across the firelight, his pale blue eyes reflecting depths she was only beginning to fathom. "What about you? You said there was a man in Philadelphia, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone probed too deeply into her past. But after everything they had shared, after the way he had opened himself to her questions, she found she could no longer maintain the careful barriers she had constructed around her secrets. "His name was Richard Pemberton," she said slowly. "He owned textile mills, had connections to every important family in the city. When he decided he wanted me, he was used to getting what he wanted through charm and money. When those didn't work, he tried other methods." Thomas waited patiently for her to continue, offering no judgment or interruption as she struggled with memories she had tried hard to forget. "He had me followed, had investigators dig into my past, used his influence to cost me my job at the school where I taught. He made it clear that he could destroy any life I tried to build unless I agreed to become his mistress." Her hands tightened into fists as she remembered the helpless fury she had felt during those months of systematic harassment. "But the worst part was that some people believed I had encouraged him, that I was playing hard to get or trying to increase my value by being difficult. And that's when you decided to run?" "That's when I decided I would rather die free than live as his possession." She looked up at Thomas, surprised by the calm that had settled over her as she finally spoke the truth aloud. "So I took every penny I had saved and bought a ticket on the first westbound train. I told myself I was starting over, building a new life, but really I was just trying to get far enough away that his money and influence couldn't reach me." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding written in every line of his weathered face. "And now you're trapped in a cabin with another man who could hurt you if he chose to." The observation hung in the air between them, acknowledging the fundamental vulnerability of her position. She was still dressed only in her undergarments and the blanket he had provided. Her clothes were dry now, hanging near the fire, but putting them on would require turning her back to him or asking him to leave the cabin, neither of which seemed practical given their circumstances. More importantly, she was completely dependent on his goodwill for her continued survival. If he chose to take advantage of her situation, there was little she could do to stop him. The rifle was within reach, but she had used most of its ammunition during the wolf attack. His pistols were fully loaded and never far from his hands. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question carefully, examining her own feelings with the analytical precision she had once applied to lesson plans and student evaluations. Was she afraid? Physically, yes. Any woman alone with a man she barely knew in such circumstances would be foolish not to acknowledge the potential dangers. But emotionally, psychologically, she found that her answer was more complex. "I should be," she said finally. "But I'm not. Not anymore. Why not? Because you've had every opportunity to hurt me and you haven't. Because you were willing to die protecting me from those wolves. Because I can see who you really are, underneath all the violence and isolation." She met his gaze steadily, letting him see the sincerity in her expression. "You're not the man who kills people in saloon fights anymore, Thomas. That's not who you choose to be." The words seemed to affect him deeply. She watched emotions play across his face. Surprise, gratitude, something that might have been hope. It occurred to her that he might not have heard anyone speak positively about his character in a very long time, that the isolation he had chosen might have been as much about escaping his own self-perception as avoiding the expectations of others. "The snow's stopping," he observed, glancing toward the makeshift barrier that covered the door opening. Sarah looked as well and realized he was right. The howling wind that had been their constant companion for days was finally beginning to diminish. Through gaps in the board barrier, she could see that the snowfall had reduced to occasional flakes drifting lazily through the still air. "How long before the trails are passable?" she asked. 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on how warm it gets during the day." He stood and moved to check their supplies, taking inventory of food and ammunition. "We'll need to be careful about rationing. And we'll need to do something about that door before nightfall." The practical concerns of survival reasserted themselves, but Sarah found that they no longer carried the same desperate urgency they had before the wolf attack. Something had changed during those few minutes of violence and shared danger. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, but partners who had proven their willingness to sacrifice for each other's welfare. As Thomas worked to improve their defenses and Sarah organized their remaining supplies, she found herself thinking about what would happen when the snow melted sufficiently to allow travel. Would they simply part ways, each returning to their interrupted journey toward different futures? Or had the events of the past 2 days created bonds that would influence whatever came next? The questions had no easy answers, but for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Sarah found herself looking forward to discovering what the future might hold. Whatever happened, she was no longer running from her past. She was moving towards something new, something that had been forged in fire and tested by the harshest conditions nature could provide. "Thomas," she said, as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. "Yeah? When the snow melts? When we can travel again?" She paused, unsure how to voice the question that had been growing in her mind. "What will you do?" He was quiet for a long time, his hands continuing to work on the door repairs while he considered his response. When he finally spoke, his words carried a significance that went far beyond their simple surface meaning. "I was thinking, maybe it's time to stop running," he said. "Maybe it's time to start building something instead of just surviving." Sarah felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a sensation that had nothing to do with the fire that crackled nearby. "And what would you build?" Thomas set down his tools and turned to face her fully. In the growing twilight that filtered through the cabin's remaining windows, his scarred face seemed softer somehow, marked by possibility rather than just violence and loss. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'd like to find out. And I'd like to find out with someone who understands what it means to start over, what it costs to leave the past behind and choose who you want to become." The words hung in the air between them, an invitation and a promise rolled into one. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of hope, of the recognition that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected forms. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but more gently now, like a benediction rather than a curse. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had been running from their pasts began to imagine a future they might build together, one choice at a time. "Just let me sleep here," she said softly, echoing her words from that first desperate night. "I can keep you warm if you want." This time the offer carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the human need for connection, for warmth that went deeper than what any fire could provide. Thomas moved toward her, his movements careful and deliberate, giving her every opportunity to change her mind or pull away. When he reached the place where she sat, he knelt beside her and touched her face with gentle fingers that traced the line of her cheek. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he had probably not allowed himself to feel in years. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, and meant it. The fire burned low as they came together, 2 wounded souls finding healing in each other's arms. Outside, the storm that had brought them together continued its retreat, leaving behind a world made clean and new by snow that would melt with the coming spring. And in the cabin that had sheltered them through the worst of the winter's fury, Sarah McKenna and Thomas Brennan began the slow, careful work of learning to trust again, to hope again, to build something lasting from the ashes of everything they had lost. The snow was falling, but gently now, like promises whispered in the dark.